Hello and welcome to this Asia Scotland Institute webcast. My name is Doug Cook. I'm the Institute Director and I'm delighted you could join us. On behalf of the Institute, I wish to offer a very warm welcome to Fred Hochberg, our speaker today. And largely for Fred's benefit, I'd like to introduce our live audience with you. We're joined by one of our Institute board members, Alan Eddington, who's the co-head of research at Water Scotland Partners. We have one of our International Advisory Council members, Lord Karen Billamoria, who's a life peer in the UK House of Lords, University Chancellor and the chairman of Cobra Beer. Roy Leckie, a director at Water Scotland Partners. Grant Doherty, a partner with Rooney Nimmo, an international corporate law firm. Ken Sutherland, President of Canon Medical Research Europe. And we're joined by two student ambassadors, Hazel Law and Samuel Matham. So welcome to all of you. And so without further ado, I'll hand over to Roddy Gow, Chairman of the Asia Scotland Institute, to lead proceedings.
Hello, I'm Roddy Gow, the Chairman and Founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this video call using Zoom. It is a great pleasure for us that we are able to talk today with Fred Hochberg. Fred is a very well-known expert on global trade, and he has written an extremely interesting book called Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word, which I very much encourage you to buy, and we will be discussing this in our coming call with him. By way of background, Fred served as the chairman and president of the Export-Import Bank of the US under President Obama from 2009 to 2017, becoming the longest serving chairman in the agency's history. He also served for 5 years as dean at the New School in New York City, and has been a fellow at the Institutes of Politics at both the Harvard Kennedy School and the University of Chicago. Previously, he served as acting administrator of the Small Business Administration under President Clinton. And before entering public service, he spent almost 2 decades leading his family's direct marketing business, Lillian Vernon, where he oversaw a 40-fold increase in revenue. Fred is a great advocate of free trade and of companies or countries working together. And indeed, in his book, I quote, he says, "The truth is that I'm not really neutral when it comes to this particular subject. Why? Because I know just how powerful a force for good it can be in the world when it is handled humanely and responsibly. I've seen the way that it enriches all of our lives, often in profound, surprising ways." So with the background of the US-China trade war, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Fred and ask him to kindly comment on his views about global trade. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Roddy. I have to thank April if she's joined us for introducing us, and thank you, Doug. And since we're a small group, I'm going to just have a few comments to just give you a rough outline of the book, and then make this more of a conversation since we're a small group today. So we should just have the first slide up, which just shows you the title of the book. And there we go. So I wrote this book partly in large part because I did not understand how trade became such a lightning rod. And I do this through 6 products, which I'll talk about in a moment. But let me go to the next slide. What I thought to frame our conversation today, and particularly with light of what's going on in the United States and around the world, and as Roddy generously said, I was the deputy and then the acting administrator of the Small Business Administration, which has been at the heart of some of the government's remedial efforts during the war. I chaired the Export-Import Bank for 8 years, and trade is certainly, that's where I got first-hand exposure to trade over 8 years. And I thought we might also, depending on how the group would like to discuss, the increasing isolationism, well, obviously of the United States right now under President Trump, somewhat of the UK with Brexit, and what that trend means, and what that means particularly in light of this terrible crisis we're facing, because if ever this is a time we have to find to work together and not go our separate way. We'll obviously be talking a lot about China, I suspect, in the next hour or so. And to pick up what Roddy said, I think that this is probably the worst period imaginable between the United States and China. It, at the moment, shows no signs of turning around between both President Xi Jinping and President Trump. We see this looks like a particularly bad trend that we're in right now, but we're going to come back to that, and I imagine we'll have a lot of discussion about that in a few moments. Let me go to the next slide to just explain the premise of the book. So I take 6 products to try and make the case for trade and make trade more understandable. Starting on your left is the Honda Odyssey, which is the most American car on the road today. 75% of that car is actually sourced, produced, designed, engineered, and assembled in Alabama. And I had an opportunity to visit that Honda assembly plant in the course of writing this book. The banana is the most consumed fruit in America, remarkably 27 pounds per person. And we don't grow any of them in the United States. And so it's a talk about seasonal vegetables, about and how that has changed our diet. I'm going to go into a little more in depth on the iPhone. I imagine that is a rather familiar product for many of us. Talk a little bit about higher education. I know that we have an affiliation with the H.S. Scott Society, Scottish Asia Society, in terms of Asian Scottish Scotland Society, and the importance of service exports and the importance of education. Game of Thrones is really a discussion about how entertainment, movies, music, television is very much a part of trade and services today. Certainly important to the US economy and certainly important to the Scottish economy. And lastly, I did focus, you may not be able to tell what that is, but that is a taco bowl, which President Trump made famous during his campaign for president. And it's a chapter that really explains how our supply chain for food has been dramatically altered by trade, and in particularly the North American Free Trade Agreement. So let me talk a little bit about the iPhone, which is the next slide. I have one always at my side, rather frequently more at my side than I think it would be healthy at times. But the iPhone is, if anything, emblematic of a product that would not exist, could not exist without trade and global sourcing. And so for that purpose, the next slide just gives you a quick view of where the iPhone comes from. And if you think about the rare earth that powers much of the power of the iPhone, it comes from Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. If you're like me and count your steps every day, the goal of 10,000 steps, you have a company in the Netherlands to thank for that, because they make the chip that records the number of steps you take. If you turn your iPhone either portrait or landscape, you can thank the Swiss for the gyroscope that's in your iPhone that makes that possible. South Korea, the Samsung company, a giant competitor of Apple, actually makes the processor that powers the iPhone. The glass, regrettably, I hate to say this, but the glass, which frequently can break, which is why I have this rather heavy leather cover for my iPhone, comes from upstate New York, from Corning Glass Company. So the iPhone by itself comes from all these countries, what it takes, and I didn't even list all of them, 43 different countries. It is assembled in China. And if you look at the back of your phone, it will often say designed in California, assembled in China. Let me go to the next slide to just show you the relative values. So while you're taking a look at that, let me just focus for a minute on China. If you assume an iPhone roughly in the US is about $1,000, about $8.46 is actually the portion of the iPhone cost that is estimated to be from China. So less than $10. And yet, because in China is where the iPhone is substantially transformed, where all those components come together, the iPhone is considered by the World Trade Organization and the US as a Chinese import. And as a result, and the next slide will show you, we actually import $16 billion worth of iPhones a year. And partly I illustrated this in the book, as I illustrated a number of things, of some of the myths, because we get very wrapped up. President Trump seems consumed at times with the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China. The iPhone contributes $16 billion of that trade deficit. We import roughly 70 million iPhones a year. But as I just showed in the previous slide, a very, very small portion of the iPhone is actually cost is attributed to China. So it is one way in the book. I also, in addition to the 6 products, try and debunk, try and pierce the bubble of a number of myths about trade. That bilateral trade deficits matter. They really do not. Right now, you may be able to see I run normally a bilateral trade deficit with my barber. I pay for a haircut every 3-4 weeks. He buys nothing from me, and so therefore I continue to run a deficit with my barber. Frankly, today I wish I was running a deficit with my barber because I'm going to be left to cutting my own hair. Trade is not always a win-win. We often talk about the important people in America. There's a whole movement to reshoring. We should do no importing. So in the book, I go into a page or two on each of these myths to say these are really myths that have been built up around trade that don't make any sense. Let me just go to the next slide. Again, just to repeat, to refresh your memory about the Honda Odyssey, fruits and vegetables, the iPhone, services, education, legal, financial, entertainment, and the taco bowl in terms of how I try and make the case for trade. And in closing, by the way, I've always thought at any talk, the most magical and welcome words of all are in closing. So let's go to the next slide. Trade clearly has winners and losers. In the United States, we see this very sharply. States such as Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which were somewhat battered by trade, battered by NAFTA, created on the whole, the U.S. economy has prospered enormously, and the trade between China, between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. Has grown enormously. But communities were hollowed out, communities were hurt, people lost jobs, and they were not able to replace them. And I think that we as a country did not give sufficient attention to that. We tried to make the case that it's a win-win. It was a win-win for our country. It was not a win-win for many communities that were really hollowed out. And those communities coincidentally happen to be battleground states, and why we also hear a lot about them during presidential elections, which I imagine we'll also talk about. I put China, as Roddy mentioned at the opening, the issue with China is far more than trade. If anything, this pandemic has shown that global health is highly interrelated. We are a much more mobile society than we were even during the SARS breakout 20 years ago. And we have to be looking at China much more holistically. It has to do with both national security issues. It has to do with North Korea. It has to do with what's going on in Iran and terrorism and oil. It has to do with climate, which is we're all interconnected. So those are all the issues. And to look at China purely through the prism of trade, which frequently, frankly, our administration is doing today, I think is a giant mistake. So with that, I'm going to turn this back to Roddy and Doug, and we can just open this up for conversation.
Fred, thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me. In your book, one of the things you highlight is the idea of trade adjustment assistance, TAA. And this, I suppose, impacts in a way on the enormous amounts of money that the administration in the United States and government here in the United Kingdom has directed towards those who are suffering from the economic turndown. And I know that in the United States, when TAA was proposed by President Kennedy all those years ago, there was a lot of resistance to it in the sense that it altered free market forces. And I wonder if you could comment on that now.
Well, you know, and President Kennedy, who introduced the idea, knowing full well that trade was going to create winners and losers, that as we opened ourselves up to the rest of the world, there would be communities and people and industries that would need assistance. He said to focus it on trade adjustment assistance versus the word assistance, because in the United States, we tend to have a allergic reaction to the word a social safety net. And I think there's too much association with socialism, hence communism, hence it's a bad word. So I think that there have been some more recent studies that have shown that actually when deployed, trade adjustment assistance has been more successful than its reputation is. We in the US have a very thin or fragile social safety net. We're looking at our unemployment system right now, which is struggling under the number of unemployed in the United States. And the fact of the matter is, Roddy, I think that, and we're going to see this accelerate as a result of this pandemic, there's going to be a greater move to digitization, to artificial intelligence, to retailers finding ways to replace people with app and computer technologies. So we need to really prepare people, not just for the adjustments due to trade, but due to a rapidly changing economy. And the difference is, you know, the US went from an agriculture economy to an industrial one and a post-industrial one, and that took 75 to 100 years. This is now happening in the span of 5 years or 3 years. That's very rapid for people to adjust, and it's causing a lot of social disruption as a result.
Fred, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to suggest now that, Doug, you field those who would like to ask questions. I saw Alan Eddington had some for you.
Hi, thanks a lot. I enjoyed that. I had kind of two questions for you, if I may. The first is around what you think happens next in terms of trade. I mean, I think today, Taiwan Semiconductor, one of the biggest semiconductor manufacturers in the world, just announced that they're going to build plant in the US, which is a massive investment, and kind of screams to me de-globalization, de-trade, just becoming a kind of cost of doing business for a company like that. So I hear all the arguments for trade. I'm just interested in what you think happens next. Maybe I'll let you run with that one, and then I can ask my second.
Okay. Well, I always like one at a time. You know, Foxconn tried to build a plant in Wisconsin, and I referenced that in the book, and it really turned out to be a very, very costly mistake. I mean, the citizens of Wisconsin are going to be essentially literally writing a check to Foxconn for $200 million a year for the next 15 years. They have concluded they really cannot build a flat screen manufacturing facility in the US. We've given up on consumer electronics a long, long time ago. So, you know, some of that is simply not going to work. I think if we look at the auto industry quickly figured out that in order to be accepted as an American car and to be accepted by American consumers, more of those cars had to be assembled and made in this country. And so today, half the cars sold in the US are of a foreign mark, and actually the quote unquote foreign and I put those in quotes, mark companies, employ as many as the American automobile industry. And certainly that has changed that. I think what we're going to see is, I think that this pandemic has shown that we need to have more resilient supply chains. The fact that in the US that 100% of our penicillin comes from China is probably a little too much concentration in one country. That's not to say we need to do it in the United States, but maybe we need to say some has to come from China, some from Canada, some from Malaysia, maybe some from India, maybe some from Spain. That just like I make the analogy, Ellen, if you drive to work every day and your car breaks down, you need an alternative way to get to work. You can't say, well, I only have one way to get to work, and if the car is not working, I don't go to work. Well, no, I either hitch a ride, I try Uber, I try Lyft, I try a bicycle, I try mass transit, and supply chains are similar. We have to be able to know that there's an alternative way of getting those products. And so I think there will be some of that, but I think some of it is very hard to do. I mean, I don't want to go on, but I'll give you, in the auto industry, for example, I visited a supplier in Mexico, in Puebla, Mexico, Rossini, and they make brake linings and shock absorbing equipment. So increasingly in the auto sector, many sectors, a company will, like Ford, will send to a group of suppliers specifications. The supplier actually designs the product, owns the design of that product, and also has to agree to make that product, that component, for 14 years after the model goes out of production for aftermarket sales, repairs, and so forth. Those are very hard to break apart. You've got a 14-year contract, and frankly, the expertise to design that part has now transferred to the supplier. So I think some of those supply chains are going to be more resilient, but they may have to be just more dispersed than they have been in the past.
Okay. Thank you for that. And
is the next one going to be harder or easier?
Easier, I think. So the next one is around the trade deficit question. It seems to me a very simple equation, and yet and so my question is, what do you think is going on? Is it just political? Is it just being used as a political tool, or is there genuine misunderstanding around what a trade deficit could or should mean for a country? Because I really struggle to understand what the issue is, if you like.
Well, I struggle to understand what that. I mean, partly I think it is. When we hear the word deficit, it sounds bad.
Sounds bad. Yeah.
It just sounds bad. So we have a trade deficit, and it sounds like that's a bad thing. Yeah. And the fact of the matter is, you know, let's look at countries that have trade surpluses. They are countries, a number of them, for many years: Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia. I'm not sure that that's a real benchmark of a successful economy. So I think partly we have to look at that. You know, and the other thing is, service exports are frankly less precise in how you calculate them. Yeah. You know, if I'm an American student and I come to study in Scotland, my tuition check, that probably counts as a service export of Scotland. Then you and I go out to dinner, well, that gets harder and harder to trace. We go to the movies, we go to a sporting event. So service exports are harder to truly track and keep and manage. And so I think that they tend to get understated, and manufactured goods are very clear. It's a product that crosses a border. So I'm hoping that we can get to a point where we're not as focused on, because part of the problem is, the problems we have had with China from trade, if you think the only thing to solve is the trade deficit, then you say, let's buy all these goods. And it isn't solving the underlying issues with China, which is stealing of intellectual property. The fact is they have a heavy hand on the scale that Chinese companies, foreign companies from the UK, US have a harder time competing with Chinese. We haven't addressed that issue, because if we think the only problem is the trade deficit, then we solve that, but that's not a problem to solve. And frequently in life and in policy, if you don't know what the real nature of the problem you're trying to solve, you will solve the wrong problem. And if I look at the Iraq War, that's a perfect example of trying to solve the wrong problem.
And do you think that's actually what's happening? They're trying to solve the wrong problem rather than just using it as a political tool because it's simple, people understand the word deficit.
It's simple, it's understandable, because it has a great report card. We had a $500 billion trade deficit. I brought it down to $200 billion. I just gave you $300 billion. It's totally fictitious, but it sounds good.
Political.
It's a great advertisement.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Fred, thank you. I'm going to pass you over to Ken Sutherland, who's got a question. Ken, if you could come on.
Sure, thanks. If you can hear me now, hopefully. Hi, Fred. Thanks for the presentation. I'm very interested in your work and what you've been up to. I work for a complex multinational Canon group company, and we devote quite a lot of effort now to consideration about internal cross-licensing and transfer pricing and all of that complexity. I think it's not unrelated to the previous question, the previous topic, but I'm interested in your view on how much complexity is useful and valuable, and how much just becomes an overhead that's essentially an accounting game almost, that's just building friction, frankly, into international trade. How do you see that?
Well, I want to make sure, and I mean, I guess I'm hearkening back to business school, and I think about, a friction is just simply not a good thing in any economy. It slows things down. Taxes are friction, poor infrastructures are friction, tariffs are a friction, and all those become literally speed bumps or impediments towards trade moving more freely. Clearly, though, we have to have some regulatory, some transparency that we're not having product dumping, or that there aren't unfair labor practices, or that environmental standards are held in place, that is not causing an undue advantage to one company or one country. But in terms of transfer pricing per se, I mean, that tends to be more frequently about where profit and cost and revenue is recognized on a multinational company. It's beyond the scope of this book, but we certainly have an issue about global taxation, and companies are very skilled at where they should recognize profits and where they don't. For at least when I was doing the book, I don't know if it's changed, but Apple Music was headquartered and the revenue and the profits were registered in Luxembourg. Last I checked, there were not that many Luxembourgian musical talents that all of us are excited to listen to. But that's a larger issue, and that's another issue we have to address. Just to quickly close, I mean, partly when it comes to China and so forth, if trading with people get to work with people from other countries and other backgrounds, and they build an understanding and a rapport. And when we build things together and make things together, I think that forms some connective tissue, some sinew that makes things like dealing with this pandemic or dealing with the issues of climate, we have some experience and some successes. Without trade, these bigger issues become really hard to solve because we have no facility of solving smaller issues.
Okay. Thanks, Fred. Appreciate it.
Fred, I was going to introduce Roy Leckie, but Lord Billimoria has got a question for you, and he's just about to leave. So if I may, can I pass over to him to ask his question of you now?
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to jump the queue, but I couldn't resist asking this question of you with all your vast experience. What are your observations of the chances of a successful UK-EU trade deal being done by the end of this year? Or do you think there will have to be an extension of 1 or 2 years?
I think that seems difficult this year. And, we're in a presidential election year, as you well know. Between that and the pandemic, and the fact that the UK and the EU haven't sorted out a trade deal yet as well, I think all those things make this very difficult to try and negotiate and get through in this environment. So that seems just not really likely. Also, let me just, go on.
That's the UK-US, but what about your observations on the UK and the EU themselves striking the
UK and the EU.
Yes.
Oh goodness. I would figured you would have a better focus on that than me.
from your point of view, what you know?
Well, I'm certainly hopeful. I'm certainly hopeful that that is able to come forward. You know, some of this, it does come down at some point, sometimes to personalities, because both sides need to feel like they're coming out ahead. It's a question whether both sides can give each other enough maneuverability to do so. I know that your former prime minister certainly tried hard to do that. I'm not in the government, you know, perhaps it appears Boris Johnson may have more political skills and able to sort of navigate that, because those are hard things to navigate. Those are very hard things to navigate. So whether there be a UK-EU this year, I think I'm a little too far away to give something that I would want you to go take back to London with, but you heard from a former American official.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And I'm sorry I have to leave early, but that's been fascinating. Thank you.
Fred, thank you for that. And I'm just going to pass now to Roy Leckie, who has a question for you.
Yeah, thanks, Fred and Roddy and Doug. It's a slightly topical question, I suppose. I mean, it's really around how you balance, you know, Pareto's law of comparative advantage with national interest on the occasions when they're not obviously aligned. So I understand the debate going on at the moment with lots of companies shifting to focus on resiliency over efficiency. But actually, and I think you were kind of touching on this a little bit when you talked about intellectual property rights and theft and all the rest of it. My question is actually a specific one around the kind of live example we're living with right now in Huawei, and whether we should let Huawei into the building of our 5G infrastructure. You know, they're great technologists. It's really important that we get 5G right. But how are our politicians going to balance what's right in the national interest against what might economically seem right with a kind of blank sheet of paper?
Right. I think this is the toughest question yet. I think the issue around Huawei is certainly one of the thorniest ones, because it also goes to, regrettably, I think we're going to be going to a bifurcated. The likelihood we have a bifurcated world on technology is increasingly likely. I kind of see the fault lines between more of a free world and a more of a, frankly, dictatorial or police state. That countries in the Mideast, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, China and others will adopt one system that has greater surveillance, greater government access, and one in the sort of quote unquote free world. But Huawei presents an enticing option for many, many countries. I think there is an open question whether what is the access that the Chinese government might have to the Huawei system. I mean, I think that the line between public and private in China is exceedingly porous. And we saw in the United States the stress during 9/11 and terrorist attacks between US companies and the government. And I would say here it is much less porous. And here there were great strains around that. So I think that one has to factor that in, that to what degree. And I know that, for example, in Australia, there was a Chinese company that was a bidder for a large part of the power grid, and there was a decision made that was just too much of the Australian economy and vital infrastructure to put into hands that potentially could, if China gets angry about something, that China could do something that would be untoward. And part of the problem, I mean, I blame China for this. You know, China has been ham-handed, you know, when they didn't like something that happened, I think it was in Australia, New Zealand, they simply blocked buying purchasing. They tend to be very high-handed, very central command. And it breeds a lot of distrust, and they have brought this upon themselves. And there's a cost to doing that. And so I think that the issues around Huawei and the caution is well-founded.
Okay, thank you very much.
Fred, thank you. And I have a question from Samuel now.
How can globalization and free trade be reconciled with the discontent of undercut industrial workers in Western economies?
Great question. We've done a terrible job. Who has done well in globalization? Rich people in rich countries, rich people in poor countries, poor people in poor countries, but many workers in rich countries in the EU, in the UK, in the United States have taken it, quote unquote, on the chin. And there's a lot of distrust, and it's justifiable distrust. So we need to really work on that. Part of the things, there is no simple solution, frankly. One of the people I talked to when I was doing the research on the book uses a term, Samuel, called lifelong readiness. The people on this call have all gone to school, like to learn, and are continually learning. For many people, when they finish high school, that's the happiest day of their life. They're out of school, they're out of that classroom, and they're on their way. But we all know education can't stop at 18 or 20 or 22. So we have to start talking to people about being ready to face the future, which is changing so rapidly. And so I think that it has helped a lot of discontent in the United States. It has helped fuel a sense of isolationism in the United States, America first in the United States, anti-immigrant. So unfortunately, it's not a single switch. But I think that what I have found is, at least in our country, there are going to be some government programs, there's some corporate programs, there's some programs at the state level. Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island has done some really innovative work in terms of making sure students in elementary school and primary classes are learning computer skills. And then she's also working with local companies that they are training people coming out of high school and community colleges to get jobs. And so the hardest group probably are people sort of 45 to 60, 40 to 60. The younger people have a sense that I'm not going to be in the same job for 30 years. So unfortunately, there is not a simple solution, but I think that another one, there's a company I met, a guy named, who was a coal miner who started doing coding, has trained a number of former coal miners, and they're now doing coding in Kentucky. So I think that we're going to have to find different examples, highlight them so people can see, well, there is another path forward. Unfortunately, the path forward about simply being angry and frustrated, and we've seen a lot of that, and this pandemic in the United States has pulled the Band-Aid off. That's made that even worse, is not also a solution. But unfortunately, it's going to take some time for us to get there.
Thanks very much.
And Fred, I have another question now from Hazel.
Hi, thank you for your insights and presentation. I'm just wondering, because China is considered as successful in manufacturing because of its technology and hence low cost. I'm just wondering what you think about the role of technology in future global trade, and specifically will US, or is it feasible for US to utilize technology in order to gain independence from China?
Well, I think that China certainly has been a manufacturing powerhouse, and more and more trade is being done on digital products. We're not there yet. We may get there on 3D printing at some point, but we're also seeing there's less and less labor involved even in producing manufactured goods. So I'll give you, in the United States, we are manufacturing more than we did in the 1950s with less than half the workers involved, because manufacturing has also benefited a lot by technological changes. So for one, there'll be less of that. Two, more and more of our trade is going to be in things such as entertainment, apps, and things like that. There's going to be less actual products crossing borders. And we've seen, and Hazel, we don't have a full understanding of this yet, but at one point, global trade was growing at about 1.5 times global GDP. We're now, this is pre-COVID, we're now running at about 1 times GDP. So part of it is, I think, that more countries are doing more manufacturing within their borders. There's more regional trade, say trade between China and some other countries in Southeast Asia. So as a result, I think we're seeing some reduction in global trade. The concern is, if we really, and we seem to be careening in this direction of having 2 different technologies, both from the United States and Europe and Japan versus China, that's going to make, of course, if we have really 2 different technologies, that's going to make communicating between the 2 of them increasingly difficult.
Thank you.
Sure.
Fred, we have a couple more questions. I've got one from Grant Doherty now, if I can pass you over. And then there may be a couple of others after that.
Hi, Fred, and thank you very much for a very illuminating talk. When US-UK trade negotiations do eventually really get started and get into high gear, first of all, how do you see those going? And on the basis that negotiations are ongoing with the EU at the same time, which do you think is more important for the UK?
Well, I would probably have to defer to you. I would presume the trade between the UK and the EU is greater than the UK and the US, but maybe that's mistaken on my part. Am I correct in that?
I think the US is the single biggest country in terms of trade, but the EU as a bloc is bigger. Right.
So one, I would imagine that the UK-EU is certainly more vital, and partly just by geography alone, and in terms of also things such as fruits, vegetables, and just the fact that they were such an integrated market for so many years. So I think that clearly is of paramount importance. I also think, I want to say that the USMCA, which used to be called the North America Free Trade Agreement, now the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and that name change is not just because Donald Trump wanted a different name. It actually is much more of a US-Mexico-Canada agreement. It's very separate. It's less about North America. I think that there are a number of factors that made that uniquely possible to go through our Congress right now. Donald Trump is probably the greatest protectionist we've ever seen occupy the White House, and has certainly had a strong protectionist credibility with voters and workers. And so that gave him particular extra backing on getting that USMCA agreement through. And also was an existing agreement. So therefore, there was concern about disrupting supply chains if that was not renewed. With the US-UK, I think that's going to be less of a factor. On the other hand, we are dealing with both advanced economies, both with higher labor costs, both with civil society, both with good environmental protections, good labor protections. So that makes the US-UK a little simpler to evolve. But we have often seen, I think many on this podcast or webinar know, so much of this often comes down to farmers and agriculture. And I'm not sure I know well enough some of the unique components of how UK farmers, ranchers, and so forth, and US livestock and agriculture standards, how well they mesh, because that has always been a challenge, and certainly was a challenge with the agreement originally that broke down between the US and the EU over a trade agreement, because largely it was more about standards and regulations than it was about tariffs.
Thank you.
Fred, if I may, and if you'll indulge me, I'd just like to ask a question myself. Really an extension of the last question and one of the previous questions about the UK and Brexit, but given the constraints in the sort of global regional trade structure with frameworks and conventions, etc., I just wonder what your view is about the UK's ability to do better outside of Europe than within it.
We're just going to roll back to two things and then come to that, hopefully. By the way, that agreement originally TTIP, which did not move forward, you will notice that both TTIP, USMCA, and even the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in the United States, we avoid the word free trade because that has been such a lightning rod for opponents thinking that we're giving things away. So that's one of the things. Two, I would say selfishly, I think it is bad for the US that the UK is not part of the EU any longer, because for the US, we had a like-minded partner in the United Kingdom at the table during EU deliberations. And the UK and the US, in terms of view of the role of government, the role of free enterprise, the role of the state, the role of individuals, the role of freedom of the press, we really do see eye to eye on so many of those issues. So I have felt, certainly in my role as chairman of the Export-Import Bank, that with the UK leaving and with Brexit, we lose a valuable voice in the entire European sphere. And I think that that is both a loss for the US and therefore it is a loss globally. So what that means for the UK and the EU, I tend to think that I am biased in this regard. I think that the US has been stronger because of our relationships, say, with Mexico and Canada, and it has benefited the three countries. And I think that the UK will be stronger to the extent it can find a path and navigate a course that lets it integrate with the EU going forward in ways that both respect sovereignty, but at the same time find ways that stitch these economies together.
Doug, thank you. And Fred, the time is passing and we're going to have to wrap up now. I just wanted to talk about one thing in closing before thanking you. You're speaking to some of us in Scotland, the home of Adam Smith and the Age of Enlightenment. And as you know, that Smith, you may recall, wrote in his Wealth of Nations, a seminal book that represents the birth of free market economics, that specialization was good and that freedom of trade was critical to the creation of successful enterprises and countries. So his argument was that it was fine for one country to specialize in producing certain things and for another to have a different focus, which suggests that the combined efforts of different countries result in a greater result, rather than the war that now exists over this whole issue of who produces what. And is there a moral in there somewhere as we think about the United States and China and how things are assembled, going back to your very interesting map of the parts that go into an iPhone? Is there a moral in that? There's nothing wrong with certain countries specializing in certain things?
No, I mean, listen, we at the United States and frankly, Scotland and the UK specialize in services, be that legal, consulting, insurance, entertainment, education. These are the products and tools of the economy for the rest of this century. So if I had to choose, do I want to be a manufacturing powerhouse or a powerhouse of intellectual property and services? That's an easy question. I think what is the challenge has been that transition, and that there are some people who will find it very hard to transition to an economy that doesn't respect or require brawn. And that will make that much more challenging for them to accept the fact that just their muscle or their ability to work in a hot factory is reason enough for gives them a sense of who they are. And so the transition is very difficult. The trend is very difficult. There are people who are coal miners in both of our countries, and it goes back generations. It has a sense of legacy, a sense of place, a sense of who you're on the world, how you provide for your family, and so those are hard and understandably hard history to change and transform, and that's going to make that a difficult transition. But yes, I believe what Adam Smith talked about still makes sense. It made sense then. It makes even more sense today. To be more specific, we are not going to go back to be making television sets and radios and assembling computer equipment and consumer electronics. Those industries have left the U.S. and they've been replaced by other things, and other things we're doing well. The hard part is not everybody can make that transition so well. And we need a society that recognizes that and finds a dignified way for people to sort of transition to something else. And the hard part is finding a dignified way of doing that.
Fred, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And that, as it draws to an end this very interesting conversation, I'm sort of minded to think that the COVID-19 crisis perhaps will pull people together to their senses and make them realize, as you yourself have said, that working together is much more effective than fighting apart. So thank you very much for your time. Once more, here's the book. Go get it. It may have been a Freudian slip of mine to say that trade is a four-letter word, because it's not. That's not what the title is. It is not. There are some that think that it is. Certainly trade with China, some people think that, but it's not. So to you, Fred, particularly in Florida, where you are, and to everybody else, wherever they are in the world, connecting with us, and to Doug for having organized this event, thank you all very much. Stay safe and be well. Thank you.